the laws and the practice. This is what we're talking about. The first webinar of this series 2 weeks ago by Professor Eric Millstone from the University of Sussex gave you an overview about how science has been used in the EU for policy making to protect public health and environmental health. It went into history, and he explained how the interpretation of science in policymaking in the EU has developed over time in general, and in particular for pesticides. This was explained in more detail by Dr. Angeliki Lysimachou of Pesticide Action Network Europe, also in the first webinar yet. Then came the second webinar last week, by Dr. Angelika Hilbeck from the Swiss Institute for Technology. I'm saying that wrongly. Let me check. The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, the ETH, on GMOs, genetically modified organisms, in particular, how current risk assessments of GMOs in the EU are actually bound to fail in the way EFSA does them. EFSA is European Food Safety Authority, sorry. And that brings us to today, the third webinar. If you have criticism on the way things are being done, then you should also show a way forward, a way in which it can be done better. And this is what Professor Brian Wynne of the University of Lancaster in the UK is going to do for us today. His talk today is entitled Towards Better EU Science, which also helps meet the democratic legal objectives, legislative objectives for protecting environmental and public health. How can we help the EU to achieve its legal objectives? And they've set a high goal. They promise a high level of protection of people and of nature, of the environment. These webinars are intended for online discussion with you, with the participants. You can do so in speaking or in writing. You can write questions in the Q&A box. If you press the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can write a question. If you want to speak, then you can raise your hand digitally by going to the participant list and finding your name and clicking the button that raises your hand. And we'll give you the word in the discussion. In either case, in both cases, I should say, we want you to state your name and affiliation, just like in a normal conference or workshop. We're not dealing with anonymous comments. Yet, in the written case, we will not say your name when we quote your question. That's because we would have to ask each and every one of you for permission to publish it. These webinars are being recorded and the recordings are put online afterwards. Those who speak up have actually have agreed by registering. This was on the registration form. By registering, they have agreed to have their names and comments and the picture published. The picture, if we manage to put your webcams on. I don't know if we'll manage that. That's been one trick we haven't quite learned yet. We're still learning all the technicalities of Zoom webinars. And this is not easy for all of us. So if anything would go wrong this afternoon, please excuse us. We have a very good man in Berlin. That's the only man who's not showing his face here. He's behind the logo of ENSA there. He sits in Berlin and he makes all this possible for us. And I hope he will be able to solve any technical problem we may run into. Let me see, I think I've said everything I should say. If you're in the live stream, you can only ask written comments. You cannot speak up. That's the only difference with Zoom participation. I think that's all I had to say, which means, Brian, I'd like to hand over the screen to you. And Lucas will show your slides. Lucas, could you put up the first slide for Brian, please?
Thanks, Deirdre, and thanks also to my colleagues Angelica and Eric and Angeliki, who've been previous speakers in this series. We've been speaking about undue reductionism in EFSA risk assessment science. And I use this word science with respect to EFSA risk assessment in a rather generous and loose sense, because it is not science. It is something which is called science and recognized by various important institutions as science, but there are various ways in which it isn't proper science. And I hope that we've already rehearsed some of these, and maybe I can add a few more in this presentation. But I want to really get to speaking about, eventually in this session, to expansionism in EFSA risk assessment. In other words, how can we improve on the quality, the public value, the reliability of EFSA risk assessment, given its crucial importance in not just innovation which goes on in fields of agriculture and food production, but also in terms of innovation trajectories and scientific research and development which support those, and to try to get us towards better science, and also science and policy from that science, which is actually meeting the democratic legal mandates, the requirements which have been laid down in European democratic legislation. Eric has already given those, but if you could switch to the second slide, Lucas. I'm remotely operating here from Scotland with a very dodgy internet. And so Lucas is actually sharing this from Berlin with you all. So this is a brief summary of the full session that I'm going to try and share with you here. And I want to start, well, this is just outlining how I'm going to move beyond only the scientific and what Eric introduced was that the first week, wasn't it, on risk assessment policy, which is implicit and value laden whilst not being recognized as such in what's called EFSA's science and its risk assessment. So I'm going to move through that and describe how those choices could be different. They are choices. They're not required by nature or by any other independent agency. They are chosen by EFSA and by its policy client and funder, the European Commission. And these are things which we need to address and look at critically, and they also just need to be rendered more accountable generally in these processes. So I'm going to refer to ways in which that could be done, but also I'm going to start with something which is within the science itself, which are values also. And these are normally referred to as the epistemic norms, which actually shape and define good science. The dominant one of those is precision. And with precision comes a conflict with other legitimate and necessary scientific norms, such as realism. It's not very good to do scientific knowledge and call it truth, which is actually based upon unrealistic observations, experiments, and designs, and so on. Neither is it, especially when we come to address environmental risk assessment for environmental policy, it's not particularly useful to actually insist upon reduced scope of your questions. And that includes going beyond laboratory knowledge to ask, under what conditions might this laboratory knowledge, artificial knowledge, non-realistic knowledge, might it be legitimate as a representation of the knowledge which we require to understand and indeed regulate or inform practices which go on all over the European Union's environment. We're talking here about European Union policy and European Union science when it comes to EFSA and its opinions, which inform the European Commission's approvals, or if we could see such things ever, refusals of applications to release GMOs and other chemicals and other agents like pesticides into the environment. So there are conflicting norms. The norms which define good science are multiple, and they're not always mutually consistent or aligned. They can actually and do actually conflict. And there needs to be open acknowledgement of that and open accounts of what the choices have been and why. And those the values which I'm going to identify here, others, philosophy of science deals with others too, but the important ones for us are precision, a perfectly legitimate and necessary or valuable part of good science, but also realism and scope. And for environment, as enlarged scope as possible in the questions you ask, in the observations which you attempt to make, and then the understanding which you attempt to develop of the linkages and causal connections which are affecting the environment and human health, of course, out there, and the connections between these various factors. So reductionist choices, which are often made, and we described in our paper in Environmental Sciences Europe in April of this year, and whose reference Angelica gave in her session last week, reductionist choices in EFSA risk assessment science are, let us not forget, choices. They are not essentials. And those choices need to be justified when we're considering, informing, and making decisions upon real world environmental policy issues, and actually real world agricultural issues as well. These choices, in other words, reflect values, and they could be different. And that's part of what I want to get to by the end of this session, and hopefully still give you time to put some questions and comments in the discussion. There are many examples which have already been given of scientific choices in EFSA risk assessment science, at least for GMOs and pesticides, which is actually a large and important part of the total of their science. These are made in sessions 1 and 2 by Eric and Angeliki and Angelica. And there are also examples of alternative good science scientific choices which were not made by EFSA. And it's a fair question to ask, why not? And where are the explanations of the legitimation of those choices which were made? So, and then I want to move to larger questions still about why science alone is not enough. We've already encountered that, particularly from Eric, in respect of risk assessment policy, which ought to be a lot more familiar than it is within European science and policy circles, particularly at EFSA, because it is in fact a principle issued by the UN Codex, the Food and Agriculture Organization, Codex Alimentarius. And Eric again has written about this and provided policy reports to the European Union about this too, nearly a decade ago. there are concealed policy choices of this kind being made in both the framing and in the practice itself, the interpretation of evidence and data, which ought to be deliberated over collectively, not only by EFSA, in fact, not by EFSA as such at all, as a scientific body. These are policy issues. And as the FAO has already explained it, these need to be made by stakeholders and policy makers, or risk managers, in other words, in their normal definitions of these different agencies within the decisions that are being made. And there are also scientific uncertainties and contingencies in all science, including, of course, EFSA science and risk assessment. And there are further questions which I'll explain why these arise too logically and rationally from the basis of risk assessment. There are questions about benefits and alternatives and social needs that the innovations are supposed to be meeting, which must also be considered in order to be able to claim rigorous good science. And then I'll move, as a development of this, from EFSA's risk assessment to the precautionary principle and the framing, which should be there and isn't, of EFSA's risk assessment and its feeding in then to European policy on all of these important health and environmental factors like pesticides and GMOs. And it's worth reminding you, I did have a slide of this, but I couldn't find it to get it into this presentation, that here we're governing innovation. We're not only governing risk. And risk assessment is actually at the very back end of the full life cycle of innovation to impacts. So there are many questions which are not even being asked when we're trying to conduct democratic and scientifically informed governance of innovation. So if you could move me on, Lucas. Now, this is just a reminder, so I don't need to dwell on this. You can maybe move us on pretty quickly here. This is just a summary of the mandates in the existing legislation, which Eric has already provided in a previous session. But I just added there at the bottom of this slide that there are also relevant here are agreed processes and practices, norms for qualifying as proper science. I'm not going to go into the history and sociology of science here, but if anyone's interested, Robert Merton in 1971 described this in the form of an abbreviation: communality, universality, disinterestedness, and organized skepticism. The latter one alone is a norm of good science, which actually in these situations, ENSA is actually attempting with virtually no resources to provide the organized skepticism, which would actually perhaps transform European science when it comes to EFSA risk assessment into something approaching proper science. But there are other processes, which I'll come to in a few seconds, which are also missing from the science which is called such by EFSA and given the associated authority when it's dubious as to whether it's that claim is legitimate. So move me on, please. Next slide, Lucas. Yeah. So this is just one of my favorite references of many here, entitled The Values of Precision, a book edited by Norton Wise, philosopher of science and historian of science at Princeton, The Values of Precision. And one essential take-home message from this book, which gives a lot more detail and explanation on this point: precision is one value amongst several which define good science. And it's precision which basically rules in EFSA science, and indeed, more broadly in many domains of academic research science too, for reasons which are not always clear when we consider the other values which are relevant, and as I said, which often conflict with precision. So I've mentioned two already: realism, commonsensical to be an important normative principle in defining good science and attempting to fulfill that norm in practice, and also broader scope. We're dealing here with environmental risk assessment, albeit in a food safety authority. We should be thinking always here food chain and ecological processes, full complexities, and not simply contained laboratory type forms of knowledge. Laboratory knowledge is important and valuable, but it always has to be qualified by asking the question, and how do the conditions of production of this knowledge under artificial, controlled conditions, unrealistic conditions, how will they be relevant, and how will they represent the world out there, which is variable, dynamic, largely unknown in many respects, and also differentiated. Along with precision often comes, and control often comes, standardization. And I come back to that later in reference to the politics of the processes by which EFSA risk assessment is being used in the European Union. So move me on, Lucas, please. Next slide. This is the philosophy 101, as I call it, elementary philosophy of science, that I've already summarized. So next slide, Lucas, please. And by the way, if I move too fast over any of these aspects, you will have access fully to the PowerPoint I've got loaded here after today's session. This again is just a kind of memo, if you like, from the previous two sessions, so I'm not going to dwell on it either. This is effectively a summary of how it is being done wrong at the moment, and how standards of good and reliable science for the purposes, let's not forget, for the purposes for which it's meant, are not being fulfilled. So I'm not going to dwell on this. It's incomplete anyway, and it's just for illustration. So next slide, please, Lucas. And just to remind us again, Eric's already explained this briefly at least, these reductionist scientific commitments occur both within the risk assessment, scientific knowledge construction processes, labs, field trials, and also in the framing of the scientific risk questions. And those choices, again, are not obligatory. They're choices, and they could be different choices. So these themselves need to be comprehensively reviewed and amended so as to render them consistent with the legally mandated norms which define what would count as EU good regulatory science. And these are just summaries of those, but also the risk assessment policy point that they're implicit, unspoken, unacknowledged normative commitments framing that science, which are known as risk assessment policy, as defined in Codex 2003. And actually, in 1983, in the US National Research Council's Red Book on risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication in the government process of 1983. And then a paper and report by Eric on this in 2009. And we've shown it already in the previous sessions, and contrary to European claims, which I'll show in a later slide, EFSA's risk assessment science is not consistent with the precautionary principle Indeed, it is often anti-precautionary. And this can, and to be consistent, let alone lawful, must be changed. To make it legal, let's get down to basics here, to make it legal. It's a European institution which is doing this. Next slide, please, Lucas. And reductionism in the framing of risk assessment questions, it mutually reinforces with reductionism selectivity and undue selectivity, inappropriate selectivity of disciplinary paradigmatic scientific inputs. Toxicology, necessary and legitimate as an input to these kinds of questions, is only one of several other important and relevant necessary scientific disciplines. That's a very challenging and difficult process to try to actually, establish in a productive way, as many of you out there will know from whichever fields you're coming. But it's required if we're going to claim that we're doing good science in these domains, and science which the public ought to be able to trust and lend authority to. So next slide, Lucas. Yeah, and further to reductionism as an often inappropriate epistemic norm for the risk assessment science in play, sessions 1 and 2 also noted at several points double standards in risk assessments, systematically downplaying or dismissing evidence of harm from scientists, from independent scientists, peer-reviewed publications and so on, while selectively emphasizing evidence of safety, even taking it as read. Where was the organized skepticism of good science in many of those examples which have already been given? And EFSA has even used fraudulent ghost-written scientific papers in its glyphosate risk assessment of quite recent past. Whether it knew they were ghost-written is a good question. Probably they didn't, I have to say, but that's a generous understanding or a generous assumption. We don't know, but they were ghost-written. They should be now actually written out of the assessments which have been made and to which the European Commission has given authority. These are anti-scientific. They're not merely poor science, they're anti-scientific. And they selectively, basically, they should be just simply written out of the record altogether and corrected because they've been historically incorporated into various decision processes. So next slide. Next slide, Lucas.
Sorry, I'm trying to.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and also in the in EFSA's processes, which then feed into EC decisions as scientifically authorized, in addition to the process reductionism and the substantive contents reductionism, which we've already described with EFSA risk assessment, there are legal procedural norms in the surrounding processes which contravene proper scientific procedures also. So, for example, applicants' dossiers are not allowed to be communal scientific materials openly accessible for independent peer scrutiny and testing. They're only accessible to the EFSA expert panel and the receiving member state. Moreover, the data therein are often themselves produced and edited by the applicant, and under such tight commercial demands for speed and economy that full open scientific peer review, even access to key R&D and RA information, like identification of materials, is simply prevented. There's also a background point about confidential business information. which legally exempts salient data for the risk assessment process from being accessible. And these ought, we would suggest, ought de minimis to exclude any data which is necessary for health and environmental safety risk assessment. Glyphosate adjuvants was one example given in session 1. Next slide, Lucas. Now, as a, to be fair here about reductionism, it isn't only an EFSA habit in doing science, it's also far more general than that. And there are good reasons in many cases why that is true. And we don't want to condemn reductionism as such, as if it's non-scientific or anti-scientific. It can be perfectly legitimate and valuable. But the questions are often about how it's limiting and excluding without acknowledgement at all, excluding various relevant and important factors for even asking the right questions in risk assessment about possible harms, let alone actually substantively interpreting the available data, designing those experiments as well, and so on. And those choices need to be documented, and the alternatives which were rejected need to be documented too, and justifications given. That doesn't happen at the moment. All of this is about improving the process. They're proposals which we have for improving that process. So next slide, Lucas. So I'm now moving to get beyond the science. And there are 3 general points here. Risk assessment policy, we've already discussed, and I won't dwell on that anymore, but we do need to remember it as an important and neglected dimension of the responsibilities of those who claim to be doing good science at EFSA and in related institutions. And there's a further point that scientific knowledge is not only framed with normative commitments and consequences, or commitments which have normative dimensions or consequences, which those making them as self-professed scientists didn't necessarily realize they were making, but they need to become more self-reflexive about precisely those processes that they're involved in doing. It's also, however, contingent as knowledge, and it's incomplete. And these are points which I'll just explain a little bit further. There's a further point here as well, which is that risk assessment is always, for good reason, case by case, etc., is always about one crop release or one chemical. Important harms may ensue from a trajectory of accumulated multiple effects, each single one of which may be insignificant. So that a single risk assessment is not necessarily going to capture a significant harmful process of which that one event is part. That's like a normal trajectory of innovation, of development of practice, of commercial processes and so on. And this question should be included in regulatory assessment. And its required expertise is much broader than for typical risk assessments as we know them and love them at EFSA. Indeed, Directive 2001-18 refers to the need for the regulation to include questions about cumulative impacts. Normal developmental trajectories of innovation and practice are cumulative processes of impact. And where are they assessed at the moment? The answer is they're not. And we might ask why uncertainty doesn't encompass this problem, but the framing of the risk assessment process is the case by case, etc., is such that trajectories don't even appear. And the third point about going beyond the science or the risk assessment itself is that there's much more at stake in these decisions about whether to permit or to not permit, a very rare kind of decision, we should remind ourselves, that there is much more at stake than only risk as defined by risk assessment scientists in these decision processes. And that's a big question, but it's one that which we can actually get a grip of if only we would attempt to do that. Next slide, Lucas. So this is the US NRC's 1983 Red Book on risk assessment, risk management and risk communication in government decision-making processes about chemicals, GMOs, etc. Well, 1983 GMOs were not by then in play, but or at least not as far as we know. But the point I want to dwell on here is just that they're referring to the quality of the uncertainty in the scientific knowledge, which has to be dealt with here as the only scientific knowledge available at present, that there are many decision points in that science where risk to human health can only be inferred from the available evidence. Inferred, notice, not concluded. Both scientific and policy choices may be involved in selecting from amongst different possible inference bridges. And they use the term risk assessment policy to differentiate these from the broader social and economic policy issues, like what's the acceptable level of risk, which are inherent in risk management decisions themselves. Again, I'm not going to dwell on this further, except, well, just let's move to the next slide. Please, Lucas, just a reminder there that those points being made by the NRC and indeed by others about those contingencies become much more significant when we're dealing, as we are here, with environmental risk assessment. And I question whether it's appropriate for EFSA as a food safety authority to be dealing with environmental risk questions, but that's a difficult kind of division of labor to be able to institutionalize. So this is where we are. The key point of the Red Book was that scientific grounds for judging causal effects are invariably incomplete, and not incomplete in a way that justifies a safety conclusion. So differences of scientific inference are likely and they're normal on the basis of what NRC, which is after all a committee composed of scientists. And incompleteness means inevitable uncertainties, unknowns, and contingencies in the risk knowledge which is presented as authority. There are also inevitable assumptions which shape the resultant scientific judgments and conclusions about what factors are most relevant, about the relative weights of different bodies of evidence, about what comparators define safety, in other words, what defines harm, and about what factors can be ignored. Good accountable science would require that all these be openly accountable, inclusively debated between independent scientific peers, and their multiple policy aspects deliberated among stakeholders and public representatives, as well as the scientists alone. Next slide, Lucas. So here I'm getting into some differentiations which become important when we look at them a bit more carefully in terms of risks and uncontrolled risks, as well as what we think of as being controlled risks. So when we have a genuine situation of risk, which is very unusual, in fact, we know both the harm and we know the probabilities of those harmful effects. So risk, in other words, is often taken to be the product of the probability of harm over the consequences of that harm. In other words, what's the magnitude? How many deaths? How much devastation of environmental, media, whatever else it might be. Uncertainties are a situation where we may know the possible harmful effects, but we don't know the probabilities of them, the likelihoods of them occurring. And that, again, can be a matter of lacking scientific research on the processes to be able to allow us to define those probabilities. Ignorance, however, is a situation of the science. It's a predicament which science always faces, where we don't know the possible effects. In other words, we don't know which questions to ask. So we can't possibly know the probabilities of effects which we don't know. And one of the most graphic, but only one of many historical examples here, was CFCs and stratospheric ozone. CFCs were produced in the 50s and 60s, regulated by risk assessment, deliberate risk assessment in the 1960s, and then declared by, I think I've got a slide of this, but let's stay here for now. James Lovelock, the guru of the Gaia hypothesis, and, you know, big guru of environmental protection and so on. James Lovelock declared in 1979 that there is no conceivable, I'm quoting verbatim here, there is no conceivable harm which can come from the release of CFCs into the global atmospheric environment. Lovelock was actually using CFCs at that time as tracers, just for their physical movement of atmospheric circulation globally. They were good tracers, they were easily observed and scientifically in the atmosphere at a distance. But nobody knew at that stage. So even in 1979, Lovelock was saying this about CFCs. Only 6 years later, Joe Farman and his students actually at the British Antarctic Survey were publishing their paper in Nature, which was actually noting the huge stratospheric ozone hole which existed in the global stratosphere above the Antarctic, and which has now caused somewhere over 30,000 deaths from melanoma, skin cancers, from that loss of ozone and exposures to high ozone levels at the Earth's surface. And the sorry, to UV from the sun. The point about that is that even the best science of the day, when the material is risk assessed, does not necessarily know all of the possible consequences. So we're a long way from a situation even of scientific uncertainty, let alone risk. We actually don't know which questions we should be asking. And it was only Farman's paper which actually began to enlighten us about those processes. There's a further side story there about the satellite data which the US NASA had, which actually declared Farman's paper to be mistaken, basically because their satellite data equipment was tuned in order to actually just simply flag, in other words, suspend and put in a side file for possible future scrutiny, the observation which their satellites did observe of the ozone hole. But their automated processes of interpretation of those observations cast them aside as can't possibly be credible. They're too far off the expected range. And it's interesting the frequency with which we see in EFSA defenses of its own scientific decisions, opinions on GMOs and pesticides, how a scientific paper which is reporting observed harm doesn't comply with EFSA's expected levels of exposure. It's a typical one. Expected means it's an assumption. It might be a collective assumption, but it's still an assumption. It's not an empirically tested belief. And it shouldn't be given the weight of observations. So another point there, but I'm getting off the point of the forms of uncertainty which prevail in scientific knowledge. Ambiguity is a condition where it's implicit as a risk assessment policy choice. What we choose to decide is the appropriate or the object which we're protecting. Is it only human mortality? Is it also human morbidity? Why is it only human? Why not other fauna, and why not flora? There are lots of questions there which again are not sufficiently deliberated and which get embedded implicitly within what's called the scientific knowledge without any recognition. And that is a big problem. But they can be changed. That's the point. These points can actually be changed by rendering them accountable and sharing them and making criticism a legitimate and indeed necessary part of the development of better and more reliable science for precaution, the ultimate policy principle underlying European policy in these and other domains. Then there are indeterminacies which are relevant in the form of system complexities which escape repeatable deterministic control, for example, controlled laboratory conditions, even if they're known. And the question about the validity of lab data for different uncontrolled and variable field conditions. And the point is that all of these latter qualities, indeterminacies, ambiguity, ignorance, and even uncertainty, are often simply reduced to risk. In other words, they're deleted, because risk is a situation where we can do a controlled risk assessment. And that is an untypical situation for many of the conditions which that risk science is attempting to represent. So risk scientists also often assume very mistakenly that risk is the only kind of public concern and the natural meaning, therefore, of the public issue. And we can't go into this today, but that has led to so many problems of public trustworthiness and indeed public respect for the scientific bodies like EFSA, but member state single bodies too, which have been dealing with GMOs and pesticides and often licensing them for commercial use with inadequate forms of inspection and assessment. So research science might well deal with all of those indeterminacies, ignorance, ambiguities, not always, but it usually attempts to, and it usually does. But science for policy certainly does not. And this is a distinction which, again, we need to be much more attentive to and demanding about in these domains, such as EFSA's risk assessment science and its uses within the European Commission and European Union. Next slide, please, Lucas. Now, yeah, I think I'm going to have to move more quickly here. So can you move on from this, Lucas, and anyone can move back to it and read it more deliberately when they've got their own time. This is just an indication of the ways in which scientists misunderstand the presence of scientific ignorance in their own knowledge. Excuse me, my voice is packing in, so it's time for me to finish. This is the verbatim transcript from a meeting of the then existent Agriculture and Environmental Biotechnology Commission, a public meeting in Europe in London, in 2001. Used to be Europe anyway. So a member of the Agriculture and Environment Biotechnology Commission, actually a very good friend and colleague of mine, Robin Grove White, asked a question of the UK ACRE, the Advisory Committee on Releases to the Environment chair, so the UK equivalent of EFSA when it comes to GMOs. He asked him whether he thought people were reasonable to have concerns about possible ignorance in scientific knowledge where GM plants are concerned. The chair asked which unknowns, which is a rather ambiguous and curious question. By definition, you do not know what your unknowns are. That's precisely the point. They're not possible to specify in advance. And the ACRE chair's reply, I'm afraid it's not possible for me to respond unless you give me a clear indication of the unknowns you're speaking about. So the AEBC member, in that case, don't you think you should add health warnings to the advice you're giving ministers, indicating there may be unknowns which you can't address? And the chair's then response, no, as scientists, this is the final dismissal. We have to be specific. We can't proceed on the basis of imaginings from some fevered brow. Well, the reference there, of course, to hysterical publics and uninformed publics. Next slide, Lucas, please. Thanks. So the chair of ACRE, who happened to be somebody I know, Alan Gray, a terrestrial ecologist, they don't have a language, as he just showed. They don't have a language for speaking about scientific ignorance. So it's a bit difficult to fulfill the question which my colleague put of Alan Gray in that exchange. Why don't you add a health warning, which goes to all ministers? Sorry, I've just messed up here my my screen, and now I can't read it. I just have to somehow get that. That's it. Sorry, I just lost full screen, and it's not big enough when it's on that. So there's a need for scientists to just simply acknowledge the existence of scientific ignorance, the existence, therefore, of lack of control in the advice which they're giving, in the EFSA's case to the European Commission, and in any member states advisory committee's case to their relevant minister or government officials. This would be a start, and it would be an appropriate modesty of science in order to do that. But there's simply no present recognition even of that as a condition which needs to be dealt with in these situations. This is what leads to the surprises that, for example, caused over 30,000 deaths in the case of CFCs and the ozone hole. And this is what is underpins a lot of the reasoning which lies behind the precautionary principle as a necessary component of policy, indeed a foundation of policy in these kinds of domains. When surprises happen also, if you could give them the next slide, please, Lucas. This is just summarizing the logic of the move from a recognition of ignorance, and actually ordinary publics recognize that point about lack of control and surprise it's typical in everyday life for ordinary people. They deal with it every day of their lives in one way or another, and they manage it. It doesn't cause them to riot on the streets or to go hysterical or anything like that. They deal with it and they recognize it. And it's often the denial of ignorance on the part of scientists, which is the more prominent part of the problem, because that generates public skepticism. It generates it. The public wasn't skeptical because it was too difficult for them to understand, which they also recognize typically. They were skeptical because they didn't see what they should have seen as the full package, which includes acknowledging the bits that we don't control, or at least that we don't control some bits which we don't necessarily know about yet. And there is a point about adequate supporting research and development for the risk assessment process itself. It can't operate in a vacuum, and it needs to be able to draw upon good, rich, diverse, deep, long-term scientific research, which is often not funded, or if it is funded, it's funded by corporate institutions who have self-interests which lead them to be very selective about what they will fund. So people ask questions like, where's their plan B? And do they really think they don't need one? Because none is usually apparent. And when they happen, who will be in charge of the responses to those surprises when they happen? And the further question, rational as a consequence from that, can we trust them to act properly when they are given charge of those surprise events? The trustworthiness problem, question rather, is often said to be a soft-headed, touchy-feely, emotional public concern, but it arises rationally from the reality of unacknowledged scientific ignorance underlying risk assessment science. Ignorance is not itself grounds for criticism. It might be if it's deliberately created, and it is sometimes deliberately created. But that and consequent mistrust comes from its normal denial, i.e. the criticism, comes from its normal denial by scientific policy authorities, not the fact that they are carrying scientific ignorance with their science. This has never been aired, as far as I'm aware, in relation to EFSA's science. EFSA's problems of public mistrust are serious and they're central. And I would suggest that a major part of that is not only the conflicts of interest, which are documented for EFSA's panel scientists, expert panel scientists, but for, this is a problem for EFSA's mistrust and lack of credibility, lack of respect, really, amongst European publics in itself. So next slide, Lucas, please. I'm now tossing and turning because I think I'm going to move on from this. Please read this in the slides in full, but I simply don't have time now to deal with it. And let's finish on this point. So the EFSA's risk assessment science, as authorized and endorsed by the European Commission and the European Union's Council of Ministers through the Commission and so on, EFSA's risk assessment science insists upon the scientific validity and authority of a singular risk assessment for all European environments. Now, there have been many disputes from member states, different member states, with European Commission decisions to approve different GMOs during its lifetime since 2002, where the European member state has basically provided a counter evidence, a critique of the EFSA's scientific opinion, approving the GMO, in other words, declaring it safe in Europe's environment, when they've used that standardized, unified, singular European Union model of the environment as the frame of their risk assessment. Now, that's the Commission's normal public stance, and they justify it by a reference to science. When the European Commission had to construct a case for its defense in the World Trade Organization's complaint made by the US, Argentina, and Canada against the EU's effect in practice moratorium on the importation of mainly US then, but now Argentinian and some Canadian. No, not Canadian, I don't think, but anyway, US and now Argentinian, maize and soya for GM feed and food. The European Union switched completely. It simply it discarded that model, which has been defending insistently, even through the European courts against member states, that singular, unified, standardized model of the European environment. Let's just have a look at how it dealt with that. So next slide. This, by the way, is a report produced in just a year after the World Trade Organization's the disputes panel case of the US and co against the European Union. The evidence that the European Commission provided against the US's complaint to defend itself with the disputes panel of the WTO was provided in 2005 in confidence to the disputes panel, a scientific body again, global scientific body. If we move to the next slide, we see an excerpt from some of that evidence. So this is from the European Commission's response to the US complaint to the WTO disputes panel. You can see here, I won't read it in full because I'm trying to save a bit of time and cut off at this point. But you can see that basically they're disputing the idea that we can actually universalize risk assessments of the kind that they have themselves and continue themselves to universalize in EFSA, that you simply can't translate and extrapolate the limited risk assessment results on toxicity of Bt maize to human and non-target organisms from US, Australia, or some other non-European countries, because the regional growing environments, the scale of farm fields, the crop management practices, local, regional, target and non-target species considered most important in the agro-ecosystem, interactions between cultivated crops and surrounding biodiversity, each could differ from published non-European studies and could differ substantially between regions and countries within the EC. Suddenly, they have demolished their own singular standardized model of the European environment, which is the essential basis for any EFSA risk assessment, environmental risk assessment of GMOs, indeed of pesticides too. It's starkly opposite. This note is confidential, originally confidential until Friends of the Earth Europe and Greenpeace Europe extracted it from the Commission under Freedom of Information legislation. But it's starkly opposite from the existing and still institutionalized, still dominant, still insistently, legalistically used to, well, actually, no, not now, for the reasons of the 2015 directive. The stance just completely switched opportunistically. So we have to ask, okay, so which one is true? I mean, this is like which one, as Donald Trump might say, is fake news. This is like a post-truth kind of situation from a body which is claiming to be fully trustworthy, fully open, fully rigorously scientific, independent, impartial. And here we have the EC basically saying what EFSA says to you in those domains is not true. So next slide, please, Lucas. So there is potential for serious and irreversible harm, according to this World Trade Organization evidence of the EC, from the use of GMOs, and considerable uncertainties exist and there are gaps in knowledge. This is just a quote from Friends of the Earth Europe and Greenpeace Europe in that document whose cover page I just showed you. It's still available, by the way, on the web. So it basically, according to them, is giving the biotechnology industry rather than the environment the benefit of the doubt. And in doing this, the Commission is failing to implement the precautionary principle as required in law. And it's also failing to implement the legal directives and the legal regulation, which Eric Millstone described and explained in session 1. I think I've got to finish here. I've already extended too long. There are some more important points in the rest of this presentation. I can't remember what slide I'm on and I can't see, but there's still probably another 12 or 15 slides which are going into other dimensions of what science is or should be for, what's its purpose in the conduct and framing and interpretation of risk assessments, environmental and human and health risk assessments for pesticides and for GMOs, for food additives, for other chemicals, and the full range of commercial products or future commercial products, which EFSA is standing as basically the only regulatory hurdle, the only place where questions are asked of the products themselves and the corporations which are actually promoting and pushing these kinds of products. The European Environment Agency in 2002 and 2013 produced 2 volumes on the late lessons, as it called it, from early warnings. David G., a colleague and ENSA member, was really the person who takes credit for these studies. He was actually an official at the European Environment Agency at that time. And I happened to be co-editor of the first volume. But all in all, 34 case studies were provided of cases where there were early warnings, and the early warnings were either rejected or ignored, not seen perhaps, but anyway, they had no effect whatsoever, and harmful effects were basically dumped on innocent victims, often in large numbers. There are so many cases, I can't mention them here, but you can read about those in the further slides, but also in the original EEA volumes as well. I think the references are also on the relevant slides. So thanks very much. My apologies for being too long, and I hope at least we can have some brief questions, but also please, any responses to both ENSA and to myself personally. I hope you saw my email on the opening slide, but I'm not difficult to find. I think it's still true to say, so you can pursue me if you need to or wish to. Thanks very much. Back to you, Diederik.
Thank you very, very much, Brian. Yes, I would like to applaud. It's a pity of Zoom, of online webinars, that you can't hear any applause, but I'm sure the participants would also applaud you. And I think we can say that, contrary to your excessive modesty, the skepticism that you have displayed in this talk is extremely organized. I think you've pointed the way.
Thank you.
I think you've pointed the way just by pointing out all the missing aspects of good science in the EU science, in the science of EU institutes, in the science as practiced by EU institutes. All these missing aspects should be brought back. And as you said, they are very often, many of them, present in normal research science. So the examples are there, and the EU institutes and other risk assessment institutes in the world should just have the courage to practice them. Now, over to you, the audience. I don't see any hands raised, nor do I see any questions. Yes, there is one, sorry. There is a first question in the Q&A box. Can you get it on your screen, Brian?
Sorry, I'm just switching screens back from my PowerPoint to Zoom. So just give me a second and I'll do my best. Yeah, no, I just need to expand this.
Why don't you just read it?
Yes, I
Gary?
will.
Yeah.
It says Brian's reflection. Brian's reflections seem to be repeated presently in the debate about regulations, the new genetic engineering methods. Deregulate, re-regulate, or simply apply the existing GMO legislation. Do you agree that your reflections are repeated there?
Yeah, I'm afraid that's true. It's difficult to disagree with that kind of judgment, Rudiger. So thanks for extending me forward to the present there. Well, unfortunately, GMOs are also present, I've got to say. I mean, the conventional GMOs are also present, as well as the new kinds of GMO.
Right.
Gene editing, as it's normally referred to.
Yes. Yeah. There's another question. In your article, Knowledge and Political Order in the EEA,
Yeah.
you describe the genesis of this agency, where the EEA, the European Environmental Agency, fought for a less reductive role than the one envisioned initially by DG Environment. They were asked to provide standardized, standardized objective information, but opted for a more innovative research design, more inclusive. EFSA was created a few years after the EEA. Why two EU agencies with similar and often intersecting mandates, and they took a different path?
Yeah, thanks, Alice, for that question. I mean, the first thing I'd want to say is that your last kind of clause, is it? No, a sentence, EFSA was created a few years after the EEA. Why did two agencies with similar and often intersecting mandates? That point about similar and often intersecting mandates is not true at all. I'll explain that in a second. And they were indeed on different paths right from the start. If you go to their original, I think there were the regulations which originally provided the terms of reference for both EFSA and the European Environment Agencies. You'll see how different they are. Just to summarize, the European Environment Agency, and as it happens, I was made a management board and a scientific committee member of the European Environment Agencies, which was inaugurated and located in Copenhagen in 1994. And actually, it's a long story. I can tell you at another time if you like, but basically I was appointed as one of two independent European Parliament, constitutionally, the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the European Statistics body had the right to appoint 2 members to the management board of the agency of the EEA, along with each member state plus the member states expanded to include Switzerland and various others, Iceland and so on, but also it was the chair of the Environment Committee of the Parliament, no longer in existence, Ken Collins at that time, who appointed me to become a management board member. So I saw a lot of this from the inside. There was a huge conflict between the European Commission and a minority of the management board of the agency, which included myself and Michael Skoulos, the other Parliament appointed management board member, to try to fight the Commission's control of the agency. And the Commission attempted to insist, by interpreting the mandate for the agency in a particular way, which was, you're an information body only. And by the way, environmental information means only information about the state of the environment in different member states. And David G., who takes credit for the hugely successful and influential Late Lessons from Early Warnings, Precautionary Principle volumes. David was a senior official at the agency at the time too. David also supported me and Michael and others in attempting to push the definition of the agency's mandate to include more than state of the environment information. So we invented an acronym, if I can remember it, DPSIR. In other words, we also need to provide the European policymakers, not only the Commission, but member states and the Parliament and others. We need to provide them with environmental information on drivers. P, what was P? Oh God, I've forgotten, I'm afraid. Anyway, stressors, that's right. Drivers, no, P wasn't stressors, was it? My alphabet's wrong. S was stressors, P was maybe pressures, but anyway, upstream information about what is causing those environmental problems. Crucial, for policymakers in the Commission, if they were going to do their job properly and protect the European environment. We have to move upstream, not only in terms of the information, but also the other questions we ask, including about what the alternatives are to this particular innovation. So the interpretation of what counts as environmental information was against the militant opposition of the Commission. It was actually expanded to include those dimensions as well. And that basically led us to the precautionary principle too, to our particular interpretation of the precautionary principle in Late Lessons, even in volume 1, was far more expansive than that which the Commission claims to. I wish I'd got to that slide, but there's a slide in which I quote the European Commission, where it basically says that, I'm paraphrasing here, I've got to emphasize, that risk assessment, the science, in other words, does not need to be brought under the precautionary principle policy of the European Union because it is already precautionary. Scientists always apply caution in their interpretation of whatever evidence they're dealing with. So they assume on faith that science is always precautionary. And as I hope you've seen by now from all of the evidence, that's just completely untrue. I'm getting off the point of your question. So the European Environment Agency innovated, and I've got to say, largely thanks to David G and his, his vision and his commitment, but with support from others too, and others with influence, including a senior scientist or two on the Scientific Advisory Committee. And we eventually broadened it out. But it's still partly, thanks to that conflict, its influence on the European Union's policies is, except in very particular cases, not really very strong, not strong enough. And EFSA, of course, as you know, had completely different terms of reference written into its constitution. And one of those, you'll see this in a later slide, wasn't actually, but it was interpreted that way by the very first Commissioner for Health and Consumer Protection, now DG Sante, who was David Byrne, the Irish lawyer, politician, who was brought in as the commissioner at that time. He gave a speech at the inaugural management board meeting of EFSA in 2002. And I've quoted this in another slide in the presentation. I'm sorry I didn't get there. And Byrne basically says, we will use the scientific authority of EFSA in order to control conflicts between member states and between member states and the Commission. Now, it didn't work, in fact, and over GMOs in particular, that was precisely what led to the conflicts between Austria, which insisted that scientifically, in a proper environmental risk assessment of Austrian conditions, which are part of European Union conditions, you have to include the fact of, I don't know what the up-to-date figure, but back then in 2009 or so, 2008, 2009, it was already over 20% of existing agricultural land use was organic. And the number of farms was even higher because those farms tended to be smaller. So you had a very significant organic component where the coexistence rules, which were brought in to try to deal with that, were never credible as an effective exclusion zone for GM crops. There's no way you could actually operate that containment to the extent which would be needed under those coexistence rules. So those failed, and the conflicts existed, many conflicts in the European Union. It was a bit scary for European Union officials and politicians, because of course the whole point was no more conflict in Europe, going right back to the setting up of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1956. So the point is that EFSA's mandate was always being interpreted with an implicit agenda, which was unity. And unity for the Commission, in their imagination, meant standardization. It didn't need to. Emphatically, it did not need to. But from that official point of view, it was assumed we have to standardize, we have to use science to standardize and unify Europe. And I've written on this, and Les Levidoff, a member of ENSA, also has written on this. And again, I think the reference to Les's paper, at least, is in the slides later on.
There's more questions.
Yes, sorry, I'll finish there because there's more.
Yeah, your slides are indeed a treasure trove of information. I hope all the participants get the time to read them at their ease. The next question is in fact split into two. The first one being, so risk assessment bodies should be renamed uncertainty assessment bodies to better reflect the absence of hard data specific evidence, question mark. And the second,
yes, sorry, yes.
I'll take that one first.
Oh yeah, hi Cora, good to see you here, or hear you here, at least, or read you here. Well, yes and no. I mean, as I indicated, uncertainty itself is typically actually interpreted amongst the scientific domains which feed into risk assessment and decision-making on risk. Uncertainty tends to be interpreted in a very limited way, which is that it's only temporary imprecision. And, you know, tomorrow's research or tomorrow's monitoring will actually eradicate that uncertainty. Then we'll have only risk and certainty and confidence, full confidence. And I'd want to include the contingencies, which should be part of an uncertainty assessment, and the ambiguities, risk assessment policy, actually, and also to the extent it can be, and I accept it can't be fully specified. You can't measure ignorance. You can't specify ignorance. By definition, it's an unknown, but you can acknowledge and deal with it. And one of the logical ways of dealing with it is consider the alternatives and actually give those alternatives where they look likely. And, you know, the alternatives to GMOs, for example, have got a long history of effective, empirically proven effectiveness. And they still feed about 60 to 70% of the world's population. So why aren't we considering the alternatives and providing them with the kind of R&D that would support them when we're starving them? So that's my response to the uncertainty assessment question. But yes, it would, as you say, better reflect the absence, or the it's not the absence entirely, but almost absence of hard data and specific evidence, which is directly relevant to the questions that we should be asking. Yeah. Second one I'm just reading now, the difference between assessment processes and scientific processes. Yeah, I mean, I think, as we've said already, Cora, on the second question, assessment is partly policy and partly science. As you know, as I quoted in the US National Research Council document in 1983, and as in the Codex Alimentarius Commission's agreement, which, let's recall again, Eric emphasized this, the European Union and each member state has signed up to, which means we should be deliberating over accountably risk assessment policy. And that should not be being left only to EFSA as a so-called scientific body. And then I wouldn't call EFSA a scientific body, as I indicated at the outset, but didn't explain, but I hope it's explained now. Science for me, and I did used to practice science of this kind, but as a material scientist, a physical scientist, not as a biologist at Cambridge University, science for me does involve openness, communality, equally and unrestrictedly shared data with everybody who's a peer. Universality, we deal with everything by the same standards, not by the things we favor with a loose standard and the things we don't like a strict standard. No, common universal standards for every different body of evidence we're dealing with. Disinterestedness, impartiality, in other words, we know about the importance of that, and we know about its sometimes its disappearance. Organized skepticism, the last one. There are only 4 actually. There are 5 letters, but only 4 principles. Organized skepticism. Well, as I've indicated, that is, it doesn't exist as a qualification of those other criteria, communality, openness, in other words, and as we've shown, universality. Consistency, you know, common sense word, consistency, does not apply with much of EFSA's science. So I'm not sure, you know, I want to say no, it shouldn't. Under the ideal kind of independent science that you and I know and hope for as university science is increasingly corralled and controlled by other agendas and other funds. We know the conditions that come with a lot of that. So anyway, I hope I've gone far enough on that one.
We have two questions left, one written
Okay.
and one oral
Okay.
question.
Yeah.
This is Veronica Fatalova. I'll allow you to speak now, Veronica.
Okay.
Please give
Hi,
us your
Veronica.
question.
Thank you.
Hi, Brian. Thank you for the presentation. And I have a question, perhaps not only for you, but also for the other speakers.
Good, yeah.
If you could tell us how or what points of your criticism and suggestion have been taken on board by EFSA over the years. Thank you.
Well, I should be looking at Eric and Angelica here. You came to a meeting, Veronica, in, where was it? Somewhere in Switzerland. Angelica, remind us.
Neuchâtel.
With the European Commission, as well as with some EFSA representatives on a project, RAGES, which, as you know, criticizes much of EFSA's risk assessment of GMOs. And yeah, I want to hear Angelica and Eric on this, but my sense is from lots of written exchanges and hearing and reading EFSA journal materials and so on, far too little would be my judgment of it. There needs to be a lot more. But I want to emphasize there, that's a responsibility not only of EFSA, that's also a responsibility of the European Commission in the form usually of DG Sanco or DG Sante rather now. In other words, the agency most responsible for the health and safety policies and regulations and the implementation of those of the Commission. It's not only EFSA's responsibility.
I think Eric, sorry.
Yes, if I may
Risk
respond
assessment.
as well. Sorry, if I may respond as well. I think that I have encountered occasions with EFSA members of staff who have acknowledged at least some of the criticisms of the sort we've advanced, but as an institution, there's much less explicit willingness to deal with it. But I think the important development has come not from EFSA or from the European Commission, but from the European Parliament, that has imposed upon EFSA an obligation to become increasingly transparent. And my understanding of the legislation is that this transparency requirement should be fully enforced from next spring. And under those circumstances, if and when EFSA becomes increasingly transparent, it will be increasingly difficult for EFSA to conceal the extent to which it is making policy judgments that masquerade as scientific judgments. And therefore, the process of changing EFSA's behavior is, how shall I put it, a battle still to be fought, but we are being, I believe, equipped with some tools for that struggle by the European Parliament, which we haven't previously possessed.
Yeah.
Very nicely put. Let me add a little bit to it as well from my practice, because we've been pushing them with the science and the research in the risk assessment, or some of the risk assessment part, for many, many years. And it feels hugely frustrating, but we've made, on some occasions, we have made in ways. I presented one of those occasions last time when I presented my talk or my webinar, where I said we've developed risk assessment concepts on how you should be doing it to be more broad in its scope and include more hazard scenarios and carry out more realistic and meaningful types of testings. So that concept has been pushed into some of the guidances of, or one guidance on environmental risk assessment of EFSA. However, they have put it so downstream while installing a narrow filter at the top that for those that even make it, for those risk scenarios or questions that you're allowed to even ask to make it through that filter, it becomes almost meaningless, that then you can assess them in, if you wish, in more breadth and detail. So, but we have to acknowledge it's in there. There's another thing, as Eric was saying, when you meet people and the staff on a personal basis, you know, and you discuss with them, they cannot, you know, say they agree or they see the validity of our argument. Whether they think it should be part of the risk assessment or not is then a personal decision or opinion on that, but the scientific argument is accepted. However, they cannot, of course, officially do that, because if they now, 10 years down the road, all of a sudden accept that our arguments, that some of the testing and some of the approaches they used 10 years ago were flawed and were scientifically invalid, the protocols were invalid, etc., etc. I've been fighting this for the Lake Spring, etc., for many years. They acknowledged that, and we saw slowly a shift in what they accepted as valid, but they were always very, very careful not to acknowledge that this was because they took up the criticism that was given to them by others, but kind of tried under face-saving terms to change it and, you know, request different types of data with different types of protocol, even acknowledging that, you know, some of the pathways, if you do it this way, are not proper, but they cannot officially or forthcomingly acknowledge that, because then it means the risk assessments they've done 10 years ago are all invalid. And that would just, the whole house of cards would collapse over them, and they would have to start it all over again, because some of the products are still out there. And they are out there based on approval, based on the data that's shoddy data. And if you admit this later, then you have a legacy of shoddy data you have to deal with, and you base your decision upon, that people will come and challenge you on if they're still out there. So they are stuck in a bit. I understand that they are in an uncomfortable situation, and the paid staff just has to defend what they're being told, what they have to defend, whether it makes sense to them or not. So it is difficult to get them to, you might see change slowly, so you don't really realize it, and they will never acknowledge that this is because they accepted your criticism, even though sometimes they use the exact same terms and even the same wording or so, you know. So it's difficult, yeah, very difficult. What I would like to add though is where I did find, because Brian raised the issue, he raised the case of the WTO legal case that the US, Argentina, and Canada had launched against the EU. I was part of that process. And I remember the day when they called me up and asked me if I would want to serve on behalf of the EU on their panel of experts to counter that, the arguments coming from the other side. And I was totally, you know, like, oh my God, all of a sudden you recognize us. And there were a number of us that they on other panels were fighting foot and nail their scientific advice. But here it came in handy. And that report that the Friends of the Earth have been reporting about is a beautiful hundreds of pages report of all of our arguments in defense of the EU. And with that defense, they didn't win. It was not winnable because some of the arguments of the member states in order to install the moratorium were really bad, but they got the most out of it. And that was based on our advice that we gave them, but we were never acknowledged for that. So. That's just how it is. That's a game of politics.
That's the politics behind science, isn't it?
So it is.
We have one question left. I should apologize for us running so late. We're a quarter of an hour over time now. This last question goes, congratulations, really. That's for you, Brian. Please comment on the effect of controlling the perception of risk by issuing the definitions of the matter or the matters. The concept of diversity, both biological and cultural, is at stake with GMOs and pesticides. Please comment on how to reinforce the importance of biocultural diversity. The cases of native corns and bees in Mexico are in my mind, and the ongoing class action lawsuit against transnational corporations. Don't say the name of the asker, please, Brian. We promise that for privacy reasons.
Yeah, okay. Well, thanks for the congratulations. I confess that, having spent a fair amount of my career working on climate change and a bit more of that time in activist initiatives on climate change as well, I'm a bit perplexed as to how it is that global biodiversity extinction, we're in the 6th extinction, I don't need to tell you that, and we're losing species of all kinds faster than we can even begin to identify them. I'm perplexed as to why it is that the importance of biodiversity hasn't been recognized as the same as for climate change or human-induced climate change, and the need for human remedial action on both of them together. So how to reinforce the importance of biodiversity? First of all, I completely agree that that reinforcement is really vitally necessary, and it's urgent, just as urgent, I would say, as climate change, and actually going in the wrong direction. And as nearly all of the relevant scientific bodies have pointed out, land use, for which they really mean industrialized agriculture, is the major driver of biodiversity loss. So we need to be doing something radical about industrial agriculture, global wide, even in those countries that we tend to think of as being dominated by subsistence, small scale, biodiverse forms of agroecology, even if not officially labeled that, like India, for example. That's where the action is needed, as far as I can see. But how we actually reinforce that recognition, just all the usual ways. First of all, good and more relevant R&D, which is actually not just monitoring, but actually showing what the causal drivers and practices are that need to be changed if we want to do something serious about improving the situation. So I don't feel as if I can help you very much, particularly not in your own context, because I do think that a lot of the action has to be regionally tailored, both biologically and politically, as you indicate in your question. So please, Eric and Angelica.
Yeah, I think this is really leading us to much the broader issues where, interestingly, many of us who started out in the GMO debate have ended up in their later life and their later careers is fighting for transformation of agriculture and pushing agroecology agendas. That's where it falls in, and that's where it logically leads you to when you take for serious and walk the talk that you talk about. You will automatically get towards, we must change the system and transform it from the bottom up. And just a little piece of self-advertisement, if you allow me. This is a book that we have just published. Some of you may know or remember. That's a follow-up on the World Weltagrarbericht, the ISTAT report, of which I was also an author, and some of the authors, or 40 of the authors there, came together and wrote a follow-up book on transformation of our food systems and the making of a paradigm shift. And this is where we are, we're looking for what happened since we published that big report, which was on the equal eyesight, Brian. It was a sister report to the IPCC report, also run by Bob Watson, who was inspired together with Hans Serum and a bunch of people to launch a similar report and process next to the IPCC, because they realized we cannot only talk about climate change, or you will not tackle climate change if you don't go about changing and making major adjustments to our agriculture land use system all over the world. So that's where it will lead us, and that's where the resolution of this will rest, in my view. But that's a bit out of the scope of what we've been doing with our risk assessment webinars.
Yeah. Right. If there's nothing more to be added to this, that's one of the most difficult questions, isn't it? Looking at the future and asking what to do.
Transform.
Yeah, exactly.
Answer.
Answer can be very short. Still needs to be done. There's a final remark in the Q&A box saying, thank you, Brian and Enser, for these many brilliant eye-openers.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to all.
It's almost 2 hours, this one. So thanks for staying with us. Most of you are still there. That's quite impressive.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Thank you to all the participants for listening and making this worthwhile to do. And a big thank you to all three speakers and the fourth one in absentia, Angelike Lysimachu. We hope to see you in future webinars. Keep an eye on our website. We'll announce everything there. In fact, we have a big roundtable webinar next Tuesday about Corona, COVID-19. You might be interested in that. Totally different subject, but also about good science, or what good science should be. Thanks again, and bye for now.
Bye-bye. All the
Bye,
best.
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
For a debriefing in the other room.